On today's Maker Mashup, we're reviewing the Mingda D2 3D printer. So on today's Maker Mashup, we're going to be reviewing this Mingda D2 3D printer. The Mingda team had sent this to me a few weeks back, and I've spent the last couple of weeks using this printer, putting it through its paces. And today we're going to be talking about the results of those tests in my honest review. So just some basic information about the printer. It is a 230 by 230 by 260 build volume. So you can print things like this large vase or any of the other prints here, all printed on this 3D printer. There is a touchscreen as one of the features for it. It's a direct drive printer as well, and it's got some nice features in it like a filament runout sensor. So today we're going to be going through our standard process for reviewing printers. We're going to find out if this is a tool printer, a toy printer, or a tinkerer printer. And as part of the evaluation overall, I'll give you my opinion on whether or not you should pick up one of these Mingda D2 printers. So with all that said, let's get to work. All right, let's get started opening up this printer here. And we can see a fairly well-packed printer. We got a flexible bed here, the typical box of goodies you'll find, including flash drives, cutters, SD cards, cables, and the parts and tools that are going to be necessary to assemble the printer. After we unpack the rest of this printer here, we're going to go ahead and take a quick look at the print head, which is a direct drive print head. You can see here there's no Bowden tube, and installation of this should go pretty easy. So now that we got the rest of this printer unpacked, it's time to put it together. So pro tip, assembling this printer, the instructions, if you're looking for them, because we didn't unpack any, are on the SD card, which I found were not terribly helpful. So a new user might be able to assemble this just by muddling through it, but overall I think the documentation could have been a little bit better in how to assemble the printer. Overall though, assembly was really simple. All you have to do here is take a couple of screws and very carefully place them through the casing all the way up to the top where it meets the extrusion, and then you're just going to want to tighten them up. Now what I did was go ahead and just get them started, and then I went back and tightened everything up, which made it pretty simple. So once you have the extrusion in place, you're going to want to put one of these reinforcing plates on the side. Now the reason these are here is because that extrusion is only bolted into the enclosure's thin steel frame. So it needs some reinforcement here to keep that from flexing back and forth when the 3D printer is running. I would have personally liked to have seen some aluminum extrusion here that went ahead and made the printer a little bit stronger, but overall this should work just fine. The print head was probably my least favorite part of the assembly. There's 3 screws here, and they're very small that you have to go ahead and get aligned with the carriage itself. And in order to do that, you have to do a little bit of a balancing act to make sure that you can get them lined up. Once I got one started, it wasn't that bad, but it wasn't a very easy process either. I would have liked to have seen this assembled from the factory and just having to pull this out along with the rest of the uprights. The last part of the assembly was really simple, and it was just a matter of plugging in the connectors around various spots on the printer. Once we got the last few plugs in place here for the stepper and the X limit switch, then we just had to go ahead and screw the enclosure for the X carriage onto the carriage itself, and we were ready to put the spool mount on. So let's talk about our assembly rating. Overall, I think the instructions were a little bit lacking, but the printer was relatively easy to assemble. We just had some screws and some plug-ins. I think that it took me somewhere around 30 minutes to get this together. A novice, it's going to take a little bit longer. So when I look at this, I think I'm going to give this an overall assembly rating of 8, and it would have been better if we would have had some documentation that was a little bit clearer on the assembly. We're going to need a manual bed leveling calibration tool, as the D2 does not include an automatic bed leveling system. Now, the one nice thing is, because this does run Marlin, I was able to go ahead and send some G-code commands to position the head in various locations and perform a manual bed leveling. Okay, it's time to load up the filament, and I ran into a little bit of trouble getting this through the runout sensor initially. I had to fiddle with it a little bit here, but I eventually got it through, and then I was met with the same sort of resistance trying to go ahead and feed it into the direct drive extruder itself. I usually have no problem with any filaments going through these, so I was a bit surprised that I had so much difficulty getting this into both the runout sensor and the extruder, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. So eventually I was able to go ahead and get it printing, and this was a file off the SD card. It was just the smallest one for our test print and our first print. And as I go ahead and run this, I did notice that they had this on a raft. So I was able to also use baby step on this, which is a really nice feature, and it was good to see that they're using a default version of Marlin, which means to me this printer should be rather upgradable. So I like that there was an LED on here, and I thought, what better time than now to go ahead and test out the LED function. So I went into the menus in Marlin here, and I was a bit surprised. Even though I was changing values, the LED itself just rotated colors. So while there seems to be an LED option on this printer, it really isn't controllable from Marlin, but it does have a nice little bit of color while your print is running. Like other printers in this class, you can see here that the 3D printer heat bed cable is rubbing up against the aluminum extrusion here, and at some point you're probably going to want to go ahead and get some cable management in there to prevent that from eating away at the cable. So let's take a minute and look what's under the hood. It's got an ARM processor in here, which is 32-bit and runs at 72 megahertz. There looks like there's plenty of room here for upgrades. You can add NeoPixels, a Z probe for automatic bed leveling, and even Wi-Fi with this board. Now you'll probably have to recompile Marlin to make all that work, but the nice thing is that the board supports this out of the box. Stepper drivers are soldered to the main board, so you won't be able to replace those, but this did come with silent steppers. The power supply in here is a 24 volt, 360 watt power supply. Here we have the first print off the Mingda D2, and the flexible bed really does make it easy to get the print off. Now, the problem I had here was getting the raft off of the 3D print, but that could have been slicer settings, or it could have also been the bed leveling, since it was a manual bed level. So I won't hold it against it, but the rest of the print really does look fantastic. I thought this print looked really good, and not seeing any banding or any defects, and that's a real plus when you're talking about the Z banding. The dual Z axis of this printer really does help with that. The next test here was to make sure that the filament runout sensor was working. So I went ahead and clipped this, and as it continued to print, the runout sensor did stop the print and prompt me for extra filament. And this worked both for the SD card, and it worked while connected to USB directly. Once again, I had problems feeding filament back into the extruder. In fact, in this particular case, I had to go ahead and cancel the print and completely disassemble the carriage in order to clear out the jam. Now, this is pretty normal for 3D printing to have to clear something like this out. However, I was a bit surprised that a brand new printer right out of the box had troubles feeding, and we had jams right away while testing the filament runout. Once we got everything back up and running, we were good to go, and we tested the power resume function. So we disconnected the power to the printer, and then we restarted everything, and it successfully heated up the printer, extruded a little bit of filament, and then restarted the print. So this was a successful test. Tolerances on the 3D printer seemed pretty good. I was able to go ahead and print this Flexi Spider, and it came out just fine, and everything all flexed correctly. The last test here was a 260 millimeter vase. And this is the full height of the printer. And one thing I did notice here is that if you're going to use the filament runout sensor, it will cause a gigantic bend in trying to get the filament to the extruder from the runout sensor. So I would not print something this tall unless you were going to bypass the filament runout sensor. Realistically, this printer probably should have been another 30 millimeters taller to accommodate the full build volume with the filament runout sensor. All of the quirks of this printer aside, the print quality is really outstanding. You don't see any banding here and really just some vertical fine artifacts. Otherwise, the print quality of this printer is really outstanding and I was very happy with it. Base mode prints also came out well. Because it's using silent steppers, you're not seeing any onion skin here at all. And I think for a 0.2 millimeter vase, this looked and came out really great. I was very happy with everything that came off this printer, from the flexi print to the benchy. I can't really complain about any of the print quality here, given that this printer is under $250. Okay, so let's talk about the features and quality. First, this printer comes with silent steppers, which is great, and it comes with a dual Z-axis, which means that the print quality is really nice compared to, say, A4988 drivers. It comes with a filament runout sensor and power resume, so it will work well if 3D prints fail for any of those reasons. It also comes with a touchscreen and a flexible bed. These are all really great features for an entry-level printer. The direct drive worked well, however, I did run into jams, which was a bit unexpected, but I think one of my big concerns was the 260 millimeter height. This printer really should have only been a 230 millimeter height, but it's like we pressed an extra 30 millimeters out of the printer in order to just make it slightly larger. So with that, I think that's a ding, because they should have increased the entire height so it doesn't snap your filament when using the filament runout sensor. So with all that said, I'm going to rate the features and quality a 7. Now let's talk about our first print. The first print came out really great out of this printer. Even though I had trouble getting it off the raft, overall, the print quality was outstanding and really came off the bed easy with that flexible bed. So for the first print, I'm going to rate this a 9. The overall print quality out of the D2 is outstanding. For an entry-level printer, having dual Z-axis and silent steppers means that these prints are coming out very clean with very few defects. So overall, I'm going to rate the print quality of the D2 an 8. Now let's talk about upgradability. This printer runs Marlin, which means you should be able to make some very minor upgrades like the extruder or even the steppers without having to reflash your firmware and just making changes through G-code. So that right there makes this a great printer for tinkerers or people that want to upgrade. Having all of the expansions on the inside for a BL Touch and also for having an expansion for NeoPixels adds even more upgradability to this printer. So from my perspective, the upgradability on this printer is a 9. So let's talk about the 3D printer class. Is it a tinkerer printer? Is it a tool or is it a toy? And if you haven't guessed already, this is a tinkerer printer. Now, if you are a maker and you want to upgrade a printer, the Mingda D2 should be at the top of your list of printers to choose from. So we're going to say that the Mingda D2 is a tinkerer printer. This brings us to our overall rating, and the average comes out to an 8.2, or the overall rating of an 8. All right, so let's just summarize what we've talked about here today. Overall, I think the construction of the printer is really good. I think the print quality of this printer is excellent. I was actually quite shocked that the fact that it does have the dual Z-axis made such a huge difference in the 3D print. The layer lines are very consistent, and I saw no Z-banding at all. It's using the silent stepper drivers in here, so the quality of the print that came out of here was really excellent. So let's talk a little bit about where my concerns and frustrations were with this printer. The extruder on this was not very good. It jammed trying to get filament in it for the very first time. If I open a printer right out of a box, assemble it, and try to put filament into it and it jams, I'm already setting a bad expectation with the end user. So with that, I think that was a real ding against the printer. I also had to completely disassemble the extruder and the entire carriage in order to go ahead and get the filament that ended up eventually jamming on a filament change out of there. And then after that, it worked a little bit better, but clearly there's something misaligned in the extruder. It's a direct drive extruder, which means there's really less in play here to make it work well. So I was a bit frustrated by that. I think for me, I'm going to definitely keep this printer and use this, but what I will do very first thing will be to change the extruder on this to something like a geared extruder. Upgrading this to a geared extruder makes this really a phenomenal printer, and I'm going to be very, very happy with this in my shop here because the rest of the construction of the printer is really, really good. Everything's solid. The only other thing I don't like about the printer, this is a preference, it's got a touchscreen interface. I still like the dial and the knob, it works fine, but you know what? I hook my printers up to Octoprint and do most everything that I need to do on that front panel through G-code, so not really that big of a deal. But for an entry-level user, the touchscreen is really a nice addition and makes it easier if this is your first 3D printer. Now, some of the other nice things about this printer that I like is because it is direct drive, flexible filament should not be any problem on this 3D printer, especially once I replace that extruder with a geared extruder. That will just make things even better because you've got a very, very short distance for the filament path, and it makes printing flexibles very, very simple. Matter of fact, I may print a lot of flexibles on this because in the shop, we're always printing different flexibles for the X301. So this is really going to be a great addition to the shop here overall. Now, this does come with the magnetic print bed, and it is a flexible, but it's going to wear out. The surface on here, I already had, just from this use of a couple of weeks, 3D prints that are kind of sticking to it a little bit. They're not really coming off very well. And of course, they included a scraper inside the kit. So clearly this is a regular consumable. I think the second purchase for this printer would definitely be a flexible build plate, something like a PEI sheet where you've got the texture and the smooth side on that. So I think those are really good options for this printer, and this printer is definitely a tinkerer printer. It runs a standard Marlin. We found that the version number in there is definitely not correct, but the fact that it does run Marlin means that you would be able to reflash this firmware. You could also do things like put a 0.9 stepper on it if you want to get rid of those vertical fine artifacts that are in there. So from an upgrade standpoint, this printer really does have a lot of features, and you don't have to buy a lot of upgrades right out of the box. So for a $220 to $250 price tag, I definitely think this is an excellent value compared to other printers like an Ender 3. If I was to go back and buy an Ender 3 of this one again, I would definitely spend a little bit more for this one, just because it does have a lot of solid features, and that extra Z-axis really makes all the difference in that print quality. So overall, in my opinion, I would definitely recommend this printer. I don't recommend a lot of entry-level printers, but this one was actually really solid and I really liked it. Hopefully Mingda will improve that extruder or even put a geared extruder. Mingda, I would pay an extra $20 just to get that geared extruder on there from the start. So definitely something you guys should be thinking of for your next printer build. Now, Mingda also has a couple of other different lines. I'm hoping that they will send me one of their larger 3D printers because they do have some that are in the 300 millimeter area. And if it's anything like this one, it's going to be a fabulous printer. So I'm really excited by that, and hopefully we'll be able to test one of those out in the future here. So with that is going to bring the end of today's video. If you liked it, make sure you mash that like button, and don't forget to share and subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you've used a Mingda D2, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think of this printer, and also if you've used it and what your experience with this printer was as well. So with that, I'm going to say thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.